Hey Ecology, let's take a few minutes here and review core concept number 1. And what I'm looking off screen at is simply a list of the learning objectives for this core concept. So in this first unit, we were looking at how ecology relies on field and laboratory studies, incorporating a lot of scientific disciplines, namely biology, chemistry, and physics, to study the interactions between organisms and their environment. So right there in that core concept itself is the definition of ecology, the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and between organisms and their environment. So you want to be sure and incorporate both the abiotic components of the environment, the non-living components, as well as those isms, our biotic components of the environment, those interactions between living organisms that we tease out more completely in core concept number 3. When you think about the relationship between ecology and the other scientific disciplines, I want you to think about your degree audit advising sheet that you work with every single semester with your advisor. Those courses that you check off to complete the biology degree, because ecology as well as evolutionary biology incorporate a lot of those disciplines that you're studying in your 100, 200, and even 300 level courses. For instance, ecology incorporates genetics, physiology, behavior, and evolution. And it also incorporates, you're going to see in the next unit, we even use some cell and molecular biology. And we're going to take those cellular processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and we're going to look at their effect all the way up on an ecosystem and biosphere level. So ecology incorporates lots of scientific disciplines. So if I ask you that question on an exam, you have many different things that you can list. So please don't stress and think, what does she want? I want you to have that understanding of how it incorporates disciplines and subdisciplines of biology, chemistry, and physics. It uses all those to look at those interactions between organisms and their environment. Why do ecologists and evolutionary biologists say their disciplines cannot be separated? Ecology studies the environment. The environment is the selective force in natural selection. And natural selection is the only mechanism of evolutionary change that produces true adaptive change. Illustrate the hierarchical relationships between scales of ecological studies. This is something you've studied since Biology 101 and 102, where we look at how the cell is the first level of biological organization that is living. It possesses all those characteristics of living organisms. A collection of cells is tissues. Tissues are organs, organ systems, etc. And here within biology, we start out on that organismal level, and we work from organisms to populations, to communities, to ecosystems, to the biosphere. List and justify the sampling and research methods ecologists use to examine spatial and temporal scales. Spatial scales is going to be anything that captures space, just like the word suggests. So you're going to be using mechanisms like plot studies, where an ecologist would go out and measure out a distinct area within a community or ecosystem and measure a variable about that area. With temporal scales, it's going to be anything that captures time. So you can use repeated photographs of a forest to look at how the structure and the species composition changes over time. You can look at Margaret Davis's work that uses pollen grain analysis to look at how species composition on broad scales, big landscape scales, change over geologic time. So there's, you want to simply think about, is this method measuring space or is it measuring time? And several of you gave wonderful examples and wonderful answers to this that you came up on your own on that first quiz. So I think this one you're doing much better than you think you are. Represent those variations in spatial and temporal scales in both words and drawings. If you can draw information, and it doesn't have to be artistic, if you can do it in arrows, if you can do it with boxes and arrows, it helps to take you out of that memorization habit that many of you have brought to this class, and it's not going to work. You're seeing that already on these quizzes. So you want to think about spatial scales, a series of nested boxes that are small in the middle and large out on the outside. With temporal scales, a timeline. Something like that will, just to give you something to visualize, to help you write a definition of something. Recall the contributions of Robert MacArthur, Margaret Davis, and Eugene Odom. Let's start at the back with Gene Odom. He was the first person to write a textbook on ecology. He and his brother Howard were the ones that started off formalizing the science of ecology, and they started off up on that ecosystem scale. With Margaret Davis, we just mentioned her with one of the methods of capturing temporal variation with the study of pollen grains on a landscape scale, obtaining those pollen grains as well as charcoal deposits to look at fire history of an area from lake sediments, and a lot of her work was done in the upper Midwest. Robert MacArthur, you've learned about him from two different perspectives. You learned about him with some of the first studies of species niches when he was looking at the distribution of bird species within the strata of the trees, and looking at what happens when you reduce competition and that you have the spread of a bird species from a lower level on the tree upward. Those diagrams are wonderful to study the ideas of fundamental versus realized niche. When the species are not in competition with each other, the area that they inhabit on those trees is a good representation of the fundamental niche. But when you have those two species present and they are competing with each other, that figure is a good representation of the realized niche with competition present. And then lastly, discriminate, before I leave Robert MacArthur, don't forget island biogeography. And then lastly, discriminate between ecology and environmental science. And to build on something that I said earlier, I said with ecology, visualize the biology degree portion of your degree audit pages. For environmental science, it's going to include those general education or your gen ed classes. This is where with environmental science, it is goal-oriented. And so you have to, anytime you're going to propose a solution to an environmental issue, you're going to have to bring in the sociologist, the political scientist, as well as the economist to see what the impact on human civilization would be. So there's your review of the learning objectives for core concept number 1.